So this guy goes to prison because he was trying to smash on the moon. Let me explain. So the dude's name is Thad, and he's 25, he's an intern at NASA in Houston, and he's part of some elite co-op program for aspiring astronauts. I mean, this is basically his dream job. But one day, while Thad is at work, he notices this big safe in the lab. And in this safe, there are a bunch of real, actual rocks from the moon that astronauts had previously gathered from all the different moon landings. And Thad is looking at the safe like, I bet these rocks would be worth a lot of money. And he also notices there aren't really any security measures around the safe. So old Thad, he comes up with a plan to steal them. Now first, he needs to figure out if someone would even buy stolen moon rocks from him. So he goes and he meets up with an old friend in Utah, this guy, Gordon. And Gordon, he agrees to find a buyer for these moon rocks that Thad is going to steal. And Gordon, he gets online and he actually does find a potential buyer, this mineral collector from Belgium. His name's Axel, and I don't know what Axel looks like, but I assume he looks like this. Now Axel, he immediately thinks Gordon is really shady. So he goes and he secretly reports him to the FBI. And so the FBI tells Axel, look, go and email with him, start a dialogue back and forth while we investigate. Because they're trying to look into whoever this person is who's claiming to be selling moon rocks. Meanwhile, over the next few months, Thad is working on his master plan to break into the safe at the NASA lab. But then, out of nowhere, one day, bam, he meets this woman, Tiffany. And Tiffany is 22, she's also an intern at NASA, and Thad thinks she is fine. And even though Thad is already married, he really wants to smash with Tiffany. Well, lucky for him, Tiffany also thinks he is fine. And they fall in love, and Thad tells Tiffany about his big plan to steal these moon rocks from the safe at NASA and sell them. And Tiffany, for whatever reason, she's like, oh, that sounds great. We totally won't get caught. And she agrees to help him with this heist. So late one night, after the NASA buildings are all closed and everyone's gone home, Thad and Tiffany, they show up to the lab, ready to pull off this moon rock heist. And they use their credentials to enter into the building, and they go into the vault where the safe is. Now, there is no oxygen in the vault. This is to protect the rocks. Plus, there's a thermal alarm. So Thad and Tiffany, they have to change into full neoprene bodysuits with a breathing apparatus before they go in. Otherwise, they'll set off the thermal alarm. So they put the suits on, they go into the vault, but then, unfortunately, Thad can't crack the safe open. And so he and Tiffany, they just say, fuck it. And they load the entire 600-pound safe onto a dolly, and they wheel the whole thing out of the building, and they put it in their Jeep. Now, believe it or not, there's actually another intern involved in this scheme for some reason. And she's their getaway driver, and she drives them all over to a Motel 6. And there, in the motel room, the three of them, they use a skill saw and a crowbar to break the safe open. And inside, there's about 22 pounds of moon rocks and some Martian meteorites, which is all valued at about $21 million. Wow. Then, the next weekend, Thad and Tiffany, they drive all night from Houston all the way to Orlando to meet up with Gordon and some potential buyers he found. So Thad and Tiffany, they take the trip to Orlando. And when they get there, they book a hotel room and they decide to celebrate their successful moon rock heist and their upcoming sale of the rocks. So Thad, he grabs some of the moon rocks and he puts them all over the bed, and then they cover them up with a blanket. And then he and Tiffany, they smash on top of these rocks. And I'm not making this up so that they can say that they had sex on the moon. Regardless, I guess their heist worked because now they're about to sell these and make millions. Until. Here's the thing about these buyers they're supposed to meet in Orlando. These buyers are allegedly some relatives of Axel's. But of course, they're not. These buyers are actually undercover FBI agents. So Thad and Tiffany, they go to this Italian restaurant where they meet up with Gordon and these buyers he found, aka the undercover feds. Then they all drive back to the hotel to finalize the deal. And right when they pull into the hotel parking lot, suddenly, bam, they're surrounded by feds. And there, they arrest Thad. Here's his mugshot. And they also arrest Tiffany. Here's her mugshot. And after Thad is arrested, the feds go and they raid his home and they find actual dinosaur bones and fossils, which he had previously stolen from a museum at the University of Utah where he went to school. So the dude is just out here stealing all kinds of artifacts. Anyway, Tiffany and the other intern, they both get 180 days house arrest, and Gordon is sentenced to 5 years in prison, and old Thad, he gets sentenced to 8 years in prison. So there's this guy, everyone calls him Hollywood. He's 19, and Hollywood is about to go to prison for life. So Hollywood, he's kind of a big deal in his neighborhood. In fact, he's the local Zaza dealer. But one day, he needs to collect some money from someone in his crew. This guy, Ben. Ben owes Hollywood about $1,200. And Hollywood's like, oh, I'm getting that money. So Hollywood and his crew, they drive over to Ben's house. But Ben, he isn't home. Instead, they see Ben's younger half-brother, this kid, Nick. Nick is 15. And Nick, he's a nice kid. He isn't involved in any of this gang life or his brother's debt at all. Regardless, Hollywood really wants to teach Ben a lesson. So they see Nick walking along, and bam, they jump out of their van, and they beat him up a little bit, and then they throw him in the back of the van, and they drive away, essentially kidnapping him. A few hours later, Nick's parents notice he's gone, and they freak out and they call the police. But by that time, Hollywood and his gang have already driven him 70 miles away, from Los Angeles all the way to Santa Barbara. Now, the gang has Nick, and he's all tied up, and they don't really know what to do with him. So they give him alcohol and other substances to chill him out. And over the next few days, in Santa Barbara, the gang takes Nick, and they hop from get together to get together, and eventually they end up at a pool party being thrown at a motel. And there's a bunch of other people there, and by this point, Nick, he doesn't even really feel kidnapped. In fact, he's having a great time. He's drinking, he's meeting people, he's hanging out with older, cooler kids. He even makes friends with this girl that's always hanging around, and he gets, a little crush on her. She is fine. So for Nick, this kidnapping thing turned into something kind of fun. Until, at some point during all this, Hollywood finally comes to a realization. Oh shit, he actually kidnapped someone. That is a huge deal. What happens if he gets caught? So he panics, and he goes and he meets up with a family friend who is also an attorney, and he's gonna get some legal advice. And this attorney straight up tells him, buddy, you're fucked. If you get caught, anyone involved in kidnapping Nick is probably gonna get life in prison. So Hollywood's just like, say less, I'm gonna take care of this. And so he hits up this other guy, Ryan Hoyt. And Ryan Hoyt, he also owes Hollywood some money, and Hollywood's like, look, if you unalive this Nick kid for me, that'll clear your debt. And Ryan Hoyt's like, alright. And then Hollywood hands him a duffel bag with an automatic pew-pew in it. Meanwhile, Nick is still back with the gang, partying, thinking, oh, they're treating me well, they're probably gonna release me soon. But of course, that's not what they do. Instead, they take him up into the Santa Barbara mountains because they're gonna unalive him. So they get him up there and they put him with duct tape so he can't resist. And there's a shallow grave there that some of the guys have dug for him. And as Nick stands there, scared out of his mind, suddenly, pow, Ryan Hoyt hits him over the back of the head with a shovel. And while Nick is down, Ryan pulls out his pew-pew, and with one pull of the trigger, 9 shots go off. And then Nick falls into the grave, unalived. And then the guys bury him, and they flee the scene. Here's the thing about this grave, though. It's shallow. Too shallow. And it doesn't really conceal the body very well. Plus, this spot in the mountains they chose is near a popular hiking trail. So within a few days, random pedestrians are just walking by, and they spot Nick's body, and they report it. A few days later, the story of Nick's body being found hits the Santa Barbara newspaper. And from there, the leads just start pouring in, because a lot of people had seen Nick hanging out at those parties the gang took him to. Not to mention, the girl who he had befriended, who he was crushing on, she hears about this, and she goes straight to the police, and she tells them everything she knows. And then a few hours later, bam, police arrest Ryan Hoyt. Here's his mugshot. They also go and arrest some of the other guys. Here's a couple of their mugshots. However, unfortunately, unfortunately, by this time, Hollywood is nowhere to be found. He's already fled the country, first to Canada, then all the way to Brazil. So the FBI gets involved, and they look for him for years, 4 years actually. And eventually they find him living a completely new life in Brazil. And bam, they arrest him there. Here's his mugshot. And ultimately, Hollywood gets life in prison without parole. Ryan Hoyt gets the death penalty, although later his sentence is commuted to life in prison. And another guy also gets life in prison, and 2 other members of the gang, they get lighter sentences. They're actually both out now. So shout out to Alpha Dog, I guess. So this guy, he's rich. In fact, he's one of the richest men in this small town in Texas. But one day, he unfortunately dies. And his wife, she goes to the funeral, and her name's Marjorie. And there, at the funeral, Marjorie meets the assistant director of the funeral. This guy, Bernie. And Bernie is known to be the nicest guy in this small town. While Marjorie, on the other hand, she's known to be kind of a jerk. In fact, Marjorie's such a jerk, she doesn't really have any friends. And Bernie, he kind of feels bad for her. So he becomes friends with her, and he starts inviting her out to things. And suddenly, they're hanging out a ton. And soon enough, they become really close. Like they're going out for nice dinners and seeing plays at the local theater. And Marjorie's got her husband's money, so she's the one paying for all this stuff. And so this relationship, it goes on for about 3 years. And eventually, Marjorie asks Bernie to quit his $24,000 a year job at the funeral home and come and become her business manager. And she starts to pay him a pretty nice salary so that he can spend even more time with her. But Marjorie doesn't stop there. She pretty much buys Bernie whatever he wants. Clothes, cars, a Rolex, several small airplanes, flying lessons for those airplanes. Plus, they go on tons of trips together. Hong Kong, Bangkok, Russia, Germany, England, Scotland, Wales, Egypt. It's crazy. Now, Bernie, he's still known to be the nicest guy in town. But now, he has access to Marjorie's checkbook. So one day, he decides, hey, I kind of want to share this wealth. Her wealth, of course. So he starts giving gifts to the local people in the town. He buys at least 10 cars for people who couldn't afford one. He buys a house for a local couple. He even gives away some scholarships to some students, all using Marjorie's money. And poor Marjorie has no idea he's doing any of this behind her back. And she still loves him a lot. She's got his photo up all over her place. She modifies her will, making him the sole beneficiary. I mean, as far as she's concerned, Bernie would never do her wrong. He would never hurt her. Until, as the years go by, Marjorie becomes more and more of a jerk, and she starts being an asshole to Bernie. She becomes really controlling, and she's demanding, and she makes him check in with her all the time, and she gets really mad if he's late or if things fall behind schedule. And this goes on for a long time, and eventually, Bernie has had enough. And one day, he just snaps. It's in the morning, and he goes over to Marjorie's mansion, like he normally does. I guess he's there to drive her to the cleaners. And as they're leaving, she's walking ahead of him in the garage, and he quickly goes into a bathroom, and he gets a rifle that he had placed in there earlier that day. And he goes back into the garage, and he points that rifle at Marjorie's back while she's not looking. And suddenly, blam, he shoots her in the back, and she falls to the floor, but she's still breathing. So then, blam, 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 Bernie shoots her 3 more times, unaliving her. And then he drags her body to another room, and he wraps her in a sheet, and he puts her in a deep freezer. And then, strangely, Bernie just continues on with his life, as if everything is completely normal, as if she's not dead, as if he didn't just murder her. Like he's still out on the town, spending all her money on himself and on other people. In fact, I think he spends almost $2 million of her money. And the whole time, when anyone asks about Marjorie, he just makes up crazy excuses as to why she isn't around. Like, oh, she's busy, she's washing her hair. And poor Marjorie, she doesn't really have any friends. Remember, she's a jerk. So no one really notices, or I guess cares, that she's not around. So no one bothers to investigate. And this goes on for 9 months. Bernie just carrying on with his life as if he didn't just murder someone. But then, Marjorie's estranged son and granddaughter notice that she's missing. And they show up to her mansion looking for her. And they're there, and they're with some sheriff's deputies, and they're combing through the place. And eventually, they find her there, stuffed in the freezer where Bernie put her. And so police, they take Bernie in for questioning, and he just straight up admits to everything. He's like, yeah, I shot her. And pow, they arrest him. Here's his mugshot. And he goes to trial, he's found guilty, and he gets life in prison. But his story's not over. Because then, oddly, this famous movie director, Richard Linklater, he hears about Bernie's crime, and he's fascinated by it. And he decides, hey, I want to make a movie about this. And he does, one where Jack Black plays Bernie. And when this movie comes out, an appeals attorney, she sees it, and she doesn't like the outcome of Bernie's trial. She thinks Bernie doesn't deserve life in prison. And more specifically, she believes this, that Bernie had an abusive childhood, and that Marjorie was also kind of abusive to him, and this had triggered him into a dissociative episode. And because of this dissociative episode, he flipped out and shot her. So she comes up with this theory, and she brings all her evidence to the same district attorney who got Bernie convicted, and she convinces him that she's right, and he actually helps to get Bernie's life sentence thrown out, and Bernie gets released on bail. And for the next 2 years, Bernie lives at Richard Linklater's house, where he waits for his new trial to start. But once the new trial actually finally happens, the jury once again finds Bernie guilty, and he gets sentenced not to life in prison, but to 99 years in prison, which is kind of the same thing. So this kid, his name's Graham, and Graham is just weird. All right, so Graham is 14, and he's obsessed with, of all things, poison. He reads a lot about poisons at home. He's always looking at chemistry and toxicology books at school and at the local library. Kid's just a weird ass. But one day, Graham decides that just reading about poison isn't enough. He needs to get his hands on some. And so he goes to the local chemist, and he convinces the chemist that he's actually older, 17, and that he needs some chemicals for study purposes for school. And so the chemist gives him access to some antimony, some digitalis, some arsenic, and some thallium. Hope I said all that right. And now Graham has everything he needs to start poisoning people, which he does. He poisons one of his classmates at school by sprinkling some lead acetate on his cookies and cakes, and the kid ends up barfing all over the place. He also starts poisoning his family at home, sneaking chemicals into their dinners and their drinks, and his family starts getting these weird bouts of sickness off and on, like random stomach pain and diarrhea. He even poisons himself a couple of times, probably sometimes by accident, but also probably sometimes to avoid suspicion. Like he doesn't want to be the only one in his family not getting sick. Like that looks suspect. Now, Graham's sister, who we'll just call sister, she gets lucky. She manages to mostly escape getting poisoned because she usually eats at her boyfriend's house, not at home. But one day, Graham manages to poison her too. He sneaks a belladonna, a toxic plant, into her tea. And so she gets sick, really sick. And they rush her to the hospital, and the doctors are like, yeah, girl, you were poisoned. Now, at this point, both Graham's dad and sister, they believe that Graham had something to do with sister getting poisoned. I mean, how could they not? He's a weird-ass kid obsessed with poison. But dad and sister think that Graham probably just poisoned her by accident, like he was just goofing around. Now, I don't know how someone would accidentally poison someone, one, but okay. Anyway, then, a few months later, Graham's stepmom gets really sick, because he's been poisoning her with antimony and eventually thallium. So they rush her to the hospital, and later that night, stepmom dies. This weird-ass kid just unalived his own stepmom. And because her death is kind of sudden and mysterious, doctors have no idea that she was poisoned. They assume she died from a prolapsed cervical disc from a bus accident she got into a while back. I mean, this all went down in the 60s, so I guess the practice of medicine just wasn't where it is now. Anyway, meanwhile, Graham has been poisoning his dad this whole time too. And so then dad, he gets extremely sick, and then he gets put in the hospital. Now at this point, some people are getting suspicious about Graham, particularly his science teacher at school. So science teacher goes and he searches Graham's school desk one day, and bam, he finds bottles of poison and notes about other infamous poisoners. And so he reports this to the headmaster of the school, and they get in touch with the family doctor, and they all agree that they gotta go call the police, because Graham is obviously up to some shady shit. And so police, they go arrest him, and he admits to poisoning his father, his sister, and his classmate. And so at 14 years old, he gets admitted to Broadmoor, a psychiatric hospital, and he's one of the youngest patients to ever be admitted there. So congratulations. But even while he's locked up there in Broadmoor, he's still low-key poisoning people. Like some of the staff and the patients sometimes find that their drinks have been tampered with. One of the fellow inmates ends up dying with cyanide in his system, like some shady stuff. Regardless, years go by, and Graham, he wants out of this place. And over time, he gets really good at lying and hiding his obsession with poisoning people. And this, unfortunately, works. After 8 years in the psychiatric hospital, when he's 23 years old, he finally gets released. And he immediately goes right back to poisoning people. He starts staying in a hostel where he poisons people there, then he gets a job in a photography supply business, and he starts spiking his coworkers' tea and coffee, and they all get sick. Then he poisons his manager at work, and manager gets really sick and dies. Then another coworker of his gets sick, and this coworker is admitted to the hospital, and within about 2 weeks, boom, he dies. But this time, the doctors are pretty sure he ingested something toxic. Meanwhile, the management at the photography supply business, they're all getting suspicious. Like, why are we all getting sick all of a sudden? And they start an internal investigation. So the company's medical officer comes to the store to talk with the staff, and he tells the staff, I don't think you guys were actually poisoned. And Graham is there, and he starts arguing with the medical officer. Like, of course they were poisoned. I mean, look at all their symptoms. Like, he was there defending his work or something. And so the medical officer realizes that Graham has a suspiciously deep knowledge of poisons. And he tells management, and management contacts police. So eventually police search Graham's house, and there they find poisons and diaries detailing all of his crimes. And then kapow, he gets arrested. And I don't have a mugshot, but here's how he looked in real life. And so eventually Graham goes to trial, and he's ultimately sentenced to life in prison. Weird ass. What if Drake and Kendrick Lamar actually got into a fight? Like a fist fight. What would happen? Well, let's say it's the night of the Grammys, and Drake is hanging out backstage with a bunch of awards he just won. And suddenly Kendrick Lamar and his crew walk by. And these two have been rap beefing for a while now. So they lock eyes, and it's on. Drake stands up, and he's like a foot taller than Kendrick. He's just towering over him. And he's like, I heard you was talking trash. And Kendrick's like, what you gonna do, Canadian Diddy? And then Drake shoves Kendrick real hard, and Kendrick drops a bunch of his Grammys to the floor. And Drake points at him, and he laughs. And then Kendrick gets mad, and he picks up a Grammy, and he flings it across the room, and pow, it pings Drake in the forehead. So then Drake gets mad, and he throws one of his Grammys back. And soon they're in like a snowball fight with his little golden statues, and it's making a lot of commotion and a hell of a lot of noise. And eventually security steps in, and they break it up. And Drake, he's still mad as security is pulling him away. And he's like, this ain't over. I'm gonna diss you so hard. And Kendrick is like, shut up and go write another pop song, you bitch. So then Drake, he goes back home to his mansion, and he's still upset. And his entourage is like, what kind of diss track you gonna hit him with, boss? And Drake is like, I don't know, let me consult my ghostwriters. And so then Drake, he gets in his elevator, and he takes it all the way down to a secret floor in his mansion. And the door's open, and he steps out into a room with all of his ghostwriters. And Drake is like, listen up, I need you to write me another diss track about Kendrick, and I need to have a very aggressive tone. And the writers are looking at him like, bro, we just wrote you like 5. Can we get a break? And Drake is like, no, I need it now. Don't make me get bass in my voice. And so his writers, they get mad. They've had enough. And they all walk out and they quit. And poor Drake, he doesn't know what he's gonna do. But then, out of nowhere, he gets an idea. An idea for the greatest stunt he's ever gonna pull. So he contacts a middleman, someone who knows Kendrick personally. And Drake explains to him his whole plan in detail. And so the middleman, he goes to Kendrick and he tells him what Drake's plan is. And then Kendrick holds up a press conference, something he's never done before. And he gets up in front of everyone and he makes this big announcement. Me and Drake have agreed to meet up. We're gonna fight. No bodyguards jumping in, no weapons, just a good old-fashioned street fight. And this, of course, makes the news. And the internet hears about it and it just explodes. And people are freaking out like, oh snap, Drake and Kendrick are actually gonna fight. This is gonna be crazy. And people start placing sports bets on it. Vegas has odds on it. It is a huge deal. And so Drake and Kendrick, they get to work and they start training. And Kendrick starts sparring with the Lucky Charms mascot because he's gotta fight someone his own size. And Drake enrolls in a women's self-defense class. They are really taking this seriously. And during all this, Drake goes and he hires some new writers. And he releases not a single diss track, but a whole diss album about Kendrick. And it blows the fuck up. While Kendrick, he writes 2 diss tracks himself. And they both go #1. And both of them, Drake and Kendrick, they end up making millions off of this beef. More money than either of them have ever made in their entire lives. But then, in the middle of all this, Drake suddenly hits up a member of his entourage. And he tells him, hey, I'm gonna need you to get a message out to my fans. If I get in trouble in this fight and I give the signal, I need the fans to jump in and just start swinging. And his entourage is like, well, what's the signal, boss? And Drake is like, the signal is when I go. And Drake's entourage is like, all right, I'll let the fans know. Meanwhile, Kendrick is over here talking to his crew. Hey, go tell the fans that if anyone else jumps in the fight, y'all jump in too. And Kendrick's crew is like, all right. And then 6 months later, the big day finally comes. Fight day. And Drake rented out a public park for the day so they can have a space all to themselves. And literally tens of thousands of people show up. Drake fans on one side, Kendrick fans on the other side, and everyone is waiting there in anticipation. And finally, a black Escalade pulls up, and Drake steps out, and everyone cheers, and he is ready to go. Then Kendrick rolls up with his entourage, and everyone in the crowd is surrounding them. And Drake steps in the middle of the circle, and Kendrick steps in the middle of the circle, and it is go time. And suddenly, pow! Drake punches Kendrick in the face. And Kendrick falls down. He quickly gets up, and he tackles Drake to the ground. And Drake punches him again, and they struggle. And then bam! Kendrick hits Drake with a hard right hook, and they wrestle around. And then all of a sudden, in the distance, the crowd hears, and that is the signal. And Drake fans know what to do. So they hear this, and kapow! They all go apeshit. And Drake fans all start charging toward the fight. And then Kendrick fans suddenly do too in retaliation. And suddenly they're all throwing hands at each other. And bam! Boom! Pow! And it's absolute chaos, like a massive Western barroom fight. And while all this madness is going on, Drake, he low-key sneaks away, and he climbs into the back of his Escalade. And his chauffeur hauls ass and drives him out of there. And Kendrick, he low-key does the same thing. And they each flee the park, leaving tens of thousands of fans behind fighting one another. Until police eventually show up and they start making arrests. And as Drake is sitting there comfortably in the back of his Escalade, suddenly his phone rings. And he picks it up, and it's Kendrick. And Kendrick says, it worked, brother. Oh, and by the way, congrats on that #1 album. And Drake is like, let's do it again sometime. Oh, I gotta go pick up my girlfriend from detention. So this is Hulk Hogan, the former WWE wrestler. But we're gonna call him Terry, because that's his real name. But one day, Terry allegedly cheats on his wife with one of his daughter's friends. I mean, they're all adults, but still, gross. And eventually, when Terry's wife learns about his cheating, she gets pissed. And she goes and she files for divorce. And poor Terry, he's just devastated, and he moves into a hotel so that his ex-wife and his kids can stay in their house. And as soon as he's alone, the weight of the whole situation hits him. And he's an absolute wreck. So Terry starts hanging out a lot more with his best friend, this guy, Bubba, aka the radio host, Bubba the Love Sponge. And he also hangs out with Bubba's wife, this woman, Heather. And Heather and Bubba, they're like a really fun couple. But here's the thing about Bubba and Heather. They have what you would call an open marriage. Specifically, Bubba likes to watch his wife smash with other men. But whatever, that's their business. However, it just so happens that Heather thinks Terry is fine, and I guess he thinks she's aight too. Because one day, Bubba goes to Terry and he's like, hey, do you want to like smash with my wife while I watch? And Terry, he's like, cool. And soon enough, Terry's going to their house and he and Heather smash. And I guess it's a pretty good time for everyone because about a week later, they smash again. And then I guess they smash a third time too. And because I guess Heather's a good friend, when they're done smashing, Terry feels okay about opening up about his personal problems, about his kids and stuff like that. So I guess Terry just feels lucky to have good friends like Bubba and Heather. Until 5 years later, suddenly, bam, a website called The Dirty, they post some images online of Terry and Heather smashing. Those images are actually screenshots from a video of Terry and Heather smashing. And Terry finds out about this and he's like, a video? We smashed, but like we didn't film it. How is there a video? Oh, but there was a video. There were several videos. Because 5 years before, Bubba had secretly set up a camera in the bedroom to record Terry and Heather smashing without Terry's consent. And Bubba put that footage on a DVD. So now there's a DVD of them smashing. Then someone, they believe it was an ex-employee of Bubba's, someone steals this DVD from Bubba and was trying to sell it to some internet gossip websites. That's how The Dirty got the screenshots. Well, eventually, this gossipy website, called Gawker, it gets a hold of that DVD. And they write an article about it and they publish about 2 minutes of this 30-minute sex tape on their website. And this Gawker article blows up, getting over 5 million page views. And now the whole world has access to a piece of Terry's non-consensual sex tape. Imagine what a nightmare that would be. You just wake up one day and the whole world has access to your private smash tape. Your family, your friends, your boss, anyone at any time could tune in and see that intimate side of you. Ugh. And of course, poor Terry, he's shocked and he's hurt and he had no idea that his friends were secretly filming him. And of course, he feels violated. He has every right to feel that way. So he goes and he gets a lawyer. And this lawyer reaches out to Gawker and they ask them to take the video down. And Gawker, they're like, nah, bro. And this is a huge mistake. Because keep in mind, throughout this whole story, Gawker could have just taken it down and this dispute may have gone away. But that's not what they do. They leave the video up and they argue that Hulk Hogan's a public figure and that his sex tape is actually newsworthy and therefore publishing the tape on their website is protected by the First Amendment. While Terry, on the other hand, he argues that's bullshit and that this violates his privacy. So then Terry, I guess, has no other choice and he files a lawsuit against Bubba and his wife and he also files another lawsuit against Gawker and he sues Gawker for $100 million in damages. Here's the thing about lawsuits though. They're expensive, like really expensive, even for guys like Terry, especially because allegedly Terry's ex-wife took 70% of their joint assets in their divorce. So the last thing Terry wants to do is spend millions of dollars in legal fees trying to take a company like Gawker down. And that is when this guy steps in, Peter Thiel. And Peter Thiel, he's a gay conservative billionaire. And Peter Thiel was also in the closet for a long time. Because, you know, when you're conservative, being gay doesn't always go over well with your fellow conservatives. So he stayed in the closet. And years before Gawker published Terry's smash tape, Gawker had published some articles about Peter Thiel and they had publicly outed him as gay. And they put out some other articles making fun of him and stuff like that. And this, of course, really pisses Peter Thiel off. But like, yeah, you shouldn't just out people before they're ready. It's wrong. So he has every right to be mad. And unfortunately for Peter Thiel, at the time, there was nothing he could do about it. Because, you know, free speech and stuff. So Peter Thiel has hated Gawker ever since then. And taking the site down has become a personal goal of his. And this billionaire is willing to spend a lot of money to make that happen. Bro is just petty like that. So he learns about Terry's lawsuit. And he has his lawyers reach out to Terry's. And this billionaire starts secretly paying Terry's legal bills and bankrolling this Gawker smash tape lawsuit. But then, at some point, kaboom! Another bomb drops. And a few more bits from the secret smash tapes make their way onto the internet. And these ones are arguably much worse for Terry. Because they're not just of him smashing. At least one of them is of Terry venting and ranting to Heather one time after they smash. And Terry is there, on video, complaining about his daughter's boyfriend, who happens to be black. And old Terry, he drops the N-word, with the hard R, several times. And not only that, he goes on a whole tirade about black people. And it's really bad. Like, shockingly bad. So WWE hears about this, and they drop his contract, essentially forcing him out. And they remove everything about him from their WWE website, and he ultimately gets booted from the Wrestling Hall of Fame. And Terry has to, like, go out and do an interview and, like, publicly apologize, and it's all embarrassing for him.
Are you a racist?
No, I'm not. I'm not a racist. I never should have said what I said. It was wrong. I'm embarrassed by it.
But anyway, aside from that, after 3 years in court, the trial of Terry versus Gawker finally concludes. And ultimately, the jury agrees with Terry. And they award him $140 million in damages, which is more than he originally sued for. And a few months later, due to this lawsuit, Gawker officially files for bankruptcy, and they shut down. And after filing for bankruptcy, I believe they ended up settling and paying Terry $31 million of the money they owed him. So in the end, they leaked his sex tape and his racism, and he got $31 million for it. So shout out to Florida, I guess. So this woman is probably the worst hitman I've ever seen, and she is about to botch this hit. But this story starts in Birmingham, England, with this guy, who we'll call father, and this other guy, who we'll call son, because they're father and son. But one day, father and son, they're out at this small clothing store, and they get into an argument with these guys, the shop owners. Now, I don't know how this argument starts or what it's about, but it escalates. And pretty quickly, it gets physical, and they all start to fight, and it is chaos. Things are getting broken, and the shop gets all trashed, and father and son end up leaving injured. But they aren't gonna let this slide. They vow to get revenge. So fast forward to the next year, and father and son are still upset about the fight in the clothing store, and they decide the only way to truly get revenge on the shop owners is to unalive them. But they don't want to do it themselves. It's too risky. So they hire a hitman. Here's the thing about this hitman though. Her name's Amy, and she's 40 years old, and she lives thousands of miles away from them in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where she works a normal, regular day job selling tickets for the Milwaukee Brewers baseball team. And there is no indication that she's an actual real hitman or that she's ever assassinated anyone before. The only thing we know about her is that she posts on her Instagram a lot. So we don't know why father and son chose her as their hitman or how they linked up with her, but regardless, son hires Amy, this regular ass woman from the suburbs, as a contract killer. And Amy agrees to fly to England to do the job, and she buys some pew-pews to ship them over to England because I guess pew-pews are hard to get there, and then she flies over. And she's all excited about this gig, and she posts about it on her Instagram. To Manchester we go. Can't wait to see my BFF partner in crime. Lol. So then father and son, they meet Amy at her hotel, and together they all finally finalize the plan. Then Amy gets one of the shop owner's number, and she calls him, and she pretends to be interested in buying a Volkswagen he's selling. She's like, I'm interested in buying a Volkswagen you're selling. And then they make plans to meet up, and this meetup is where she plans to assassinate them. And of course, before she goes on this hit, she posts a picture of herself on Instagram with the devil horns. Anyway, the next night, Amy puts on a hijab as a disguise, and then she drives her rental car over to meet one of the shop owners near his home. And so she gets there, and the shop owner pulls up, and as he's getting out of his car, Amy gets out of her car, leaving the door open. And she's got a pew-pew, and she walks toward him, and she raises her arm, pointing the pew-pew right at his head. And shop owner, he sees that she's about to shoot him, and he's like, oh shit! And right then, she pulls the trigger. Click, click. The pew-pew jams. And so the shop owner, he jumps back into his car, and he speeds away, but he crashes into Amy's open car door on his way out. And Amy's like, damn it, because now the door on this rental car is all messed up, and it won't close, and so she just abandons this car. 3 hours later, she takes a taxi back to his house to try and assassinate him again. And during this time, she's sending him threatening text messages, trying to lure him out of his house. She's like, where are you hiding? Stop playing hide and seek. You're lucky the pew-pew jammed. And eventually, she just gets the pew-pew out, and she just randomly shoots 3 times into the house, and luckily, no one was hit. Like I said, worst hitman ever. But 2 days later, Amy flies back to Wisconsin, and while on the flight, she posts on her Instagram again. I couldn't get a window seat. I think this is the first time ever I don't get to sit by a window. Crying emoji. Now, I don't actually know if Amy and Sun are romantically involved, but a few days after she flies back to the US, Sun flies there too. And while he's in the US, police back in England, they find CCTV footage of him and his dad driving around that area at the time of the hit. And they're able to connect them to the shop owner's assassination attempt. But Sun doesn't know this yet. And then a month later, Sun flies back to England and bam, police arrest him. Here's his mugshot. And they eventually arrest father too. Here's his mugshot. And then when Amy hears that Sun got arrested, she knows they're coming after her next, and she knows she has to disappear. So she tells her family that she got a job as a radio DJ in Armenia. And she flees the country to go live somewhere in Armenia. And she's living there quietly, and she's hiding out, but she's still posting on Instagram for some reason. Until 5 years go by, and she still hasn't been caught. And Sun and father, they go to trial, and they're found guilty of conspiracy to murder. But suddenly, there's all this interest in the case, and so now there's an international manhunt, people looking for Amy. And Amy, she's still in Armenia. And she learns about this, and she's like, oh shit, not again. And she immediately deletes all her social media accounts, but not before reporters from the Daily Mail, of all places, they find her accounts, and they sift through all her posts. And doing that, they find exactly which direction the windows in her apartment are facing. And they find the pool she frequently swims in. And through that, they actually find her apartment, and they're able to get CCTV footage of her running errands, proving that she still lives there. So they tell police, and eventually, bam, Armenian police, they go and arrest her. And she's extradited back to England, and as of now, she hasn't been to trial yet. The case is actually still ongoing. So we'll see what happens. So this guy, let's call him Murdery. And Murdery, he likes to murder people, I guess. But he doesn't start out that way. He starts out just robbing people. He steals things, he breaks into cars, stuff like that. And one day, he flies over from France to Thailand with his girlfriend. And once he's there, he's got this whole scheme to scam mostly Western tourists. And like he befriends them, and then he spikes their food and drinks with sleeping pills or some other pill to make them sick, and then he robs them of their passports and money. So while he's there in Thailand, Murdery befriends this American woman, a backpacker. And he befriends her, and he drugs her, and he goes to rob her, but I guess he decides that robbing her isn't enough, and he ends up throwing her in the ocean to drown. Oh, but he doesn't stop there, because soon after, he unalives another tourist, but this time he burns the body and leaves it on the side of the road. But that tourist's girlfriend, she notices he's missing, and she goes to Murdery, and she's asking him, I guess, too many questions, and then Murdery drugs her, and he drowns her too. Now, at this point, Murdery is living a pretty good life off the money he steals from these unsuspecting backpackers. But he knows he's got to keep moving before people get suspicious that all these backpackers around him are dying. So Murdery invites this Dutch couple he met in Hong Kong to come visit him in Thailand. And of course, when the couple gets there, Murdery drugs them, and he strangles them and burns them alive. Once they're unalived, he takes their passports, and he and his girlfriend use them to flee Thailand and head all the way over to Nepal. While in Nepal, Murdery befriends a Canadian guy and an American woman, and he stabs them and he burns them. Now, these two murders in Nepal, they'll become important later. Anyway, once he gets their passports, he and his girlfriend go back to Thailand, and from there, he flees by road all the way to India. And once he's in India, Murdery continues his string of crimes. He unalives yet another guy, and then he uses the guy's passport to travel to Singapore, and then back to India, and then Thailand again. And I mean, like, nobody is safe when it comes to Murdery. Like, one time, he's just trying to rob someone, and he accidentally gives them too much poison, so they die. And another time, his close friend, who had helped him commit some of these murders, I guess they have some kind of falling out, and so Murdery just gets rid of him, and the friend is like, never seen again, ever. Like, I can't even name all the crimes this guy did. But anyway, one day, Murdery is back in India, and he gets this crazy idea. He's gonna try to rob 60 people at once. A bunch of French engineering students that he had just met in New Delhi. And so he puts drugs in 60 water bottles, and he starts handing them out to these students. He's trying to drug them. And a bunch of the students drink it, but the drugs start working too fast. And by the time Murdery is finishing handing out these water bottles, the first students who drank, they're starting to pass out and fall unconscious. So then some of the other students realize what's happening, and I guess they're able to overpower Murdery, and they call the police. And the police come, and then bam, they arrest him. And he gets 12 years in prison for poisoning and robbing the engineering students, and they try to convict him for some of the murders he did in the past, but the conviction is ultimately overturned due to lack of evidence. Now, while in prison, Murdery still has a big problem. He's now wanted back in Thailand on suspicion of several of those murders he committed. So Thailand wants to extradite him as soon as he's out of prison in India. And while he'd be there in Thailand, he would probably get the death penalty. And Murdery, he doesn't want the death penalty. So he comes up with a plan to stay in Indian prison much longer. And he goes and he gives prison guards some candy laced with sedatives. And those guards eat it, and they pass out, and while they're passed out, he just straight up walks out of the prison. Like, that's how he escapes. But then he allows himself to be caught. And because of that, because of this little escape, they sentence him to another 10 years in that Indian prison, which is perfect for him, because by the time he'll be released, the 20-year statute of limitations will be up for all his crimes in Thailand. So he won't be extradited there, and he won't get the death penalty. It's pretty slick. So anyway, many years pass, and Murdery serves his full term, and eventually they let him out. And now he's in his 50s, and it seems like he's never going to be convicted for any of those murders he did in the past. Until 6 years go by, and he's out of prison now. And one day, for some reason, Murdery decides to take a little vacation over to Nepal. Here's the thing about Nepal. Murdery is also wanted there too, for unaliving that Canadian guy and that American woman 30 years before, those two that I mentioned. And Nepal has no statute of limitations on murder. So while he's there vacationing, bam, Murdery gets arrested. And he goes to trial, and he gets sentenced to 20 years in prison, and 19 years later, he gets out. So the dude is out now. And at some point, he sells the film and book rights to his life story for $15 million. So this guy is a serial killer, and he's now out of prison, and he has $15 million. Fuck my life. So this super Christian guy is about to unalive his own wife. And unfortunately, he's gonna get away with it. Now the guy, his name's Colin, and Colin is a very religious dude. He's also a dentist. But one day, at a church activity, he meets this woman. Her name's Hazel. And Colin thinks Hazel is fine, so they hit it off, and pretty soon, Colin and Hazel low-key start smashing. Here's the problem with that, though. Colin is actually already married, and he has a bunch of kids. And here's the other problem with that. Hazel is also married with kids. Regardless, they secretly keep their affair going, and they just keep smashing away. And this goes on for a few months, but then they get busted. Someone from the church they go to is at a local park, and he catches them in the act. And he tells the pastor at their church, and pastor tells Colin's wife, and this blows their whole affair wide open. And so Colin and Hazel each have to go to their respective spouses and confess that they're having an affair. Now, Colin's wife, who we'll just call Colin's wife, she's absolutely devastated by this news, and she can't handle it. And eventually, she tries to unalive herself with sleeping pills. But lucky for her, she's not successful. She survives. However, allegedly, Colin finds her suicide note, and this suicide note gives him an idea of how to solve his problem. Because despite all the trauma he's caused his wife, he still really wants to keep smashing with Hazel. Now, he could go and just get a divorce, and Hazel could get a divorce, and then they could just be together like normal people, but they decide they can't do that. Because remember, he is a super religious Christian, and so is she. And because of that, they decide divorce is just not an option. I mean, it's frowned upon by the church. Instead, they go a different route. And Colin and Hazel come up with a plan. They're gonna unalive each other's spouses so that they can be together and that they can live happily ever after. So they're too religious for divorce, but not too religious for murder. Got it. So anyway, one night, Colin's wife is asleep in the living room on the couch. And this is not surprising since they're having so many problems in their marriage. But Colin, he sneaks into the garage and he's got some kind of hose and he attaches that hose to the exhaust pipe of their car while the car is running. Then he takes the other end of that hose and he sneaks into the living room and he holds it near his wife's face. Now, obviously, he's trying to poison her with carbon monoxide by trying to get her to inhale the fumes from the running car. And she does breathe in these fumes, but she doesn't immediately die. Instead, she wakes up and her eyes open and she starts to struggle because she realizes she can't really breathe. And Colin, he holds her down and he covers her face with a quilt and he sticks the hose under there and she struggles and she takes her last few breaths until she's unalived. Then Colin carries her body and he puts it in the trunk of his car and he drives toward Hazel's house. Meanwhile, over at Hazel's house, she is completing her part of the plan. And her husband is there at the house with her, this guy, and she low-key slips him some sedatives and he passes out. He's asleep. Then Colin arrives and he does the same thing he did to his wife. He attaches the hose to the exhaust of his car again and he creeps into the bedroom with that hose and he puts it near the husband's face so that he'll breathe in the fumes. And then husband wakes up and there's a struggle and a fight, but husband is just too sedated and he loses the fight and Colin holds him down and puts the hose up to his face and he breathes in too much of the fumes and husband ultimately dies. Then Colin moves the body to the car where his wife's body is and he drives the bodies over to another family member's house and he parks the car in the garage and he arranges the husband in the front seat and he puts his wife in the back seat. Then he hooks up a hose to the exhaust pipe and he runs it up to the window and he makes it look like they were trying to carbon monoxide poison themselves, like it was a double suicide. And he reports it to the police and police eventually find the bodies and they believe the story that it was a double suicide. And I don't really think police do a very good job of investigating this. They're just like, yep, two people who didn't really know each other decided to unalive themselves together. That makes sense. Case closed. Anyway, then to make it worse, the medical examiner examines the bodies and they agree and they rule it a double suicide. So Colin and Hazel straight up get away with this crime. And what's even better for them, Colin makes some bank from his wife's death. He allegedly receives over 300,000 pounds from her will, or about 400,000 US dollars. He also makes money from a life insurance policy and some money from his late father-in-law's estate. Dude has got some cash now. So he and Hazel are able to take all this money and live happily ever after as the good Christian family they are. But 5 years later, unfortunately for them, their relationship fizzles out and they end up splitting up. And eventually Colin moves on and he remarries and so does Hazel. And it seems like since they moved on, no one will ever speak of those murders again. Until about 16 years later, Colin's life starts falling apart. First, his 22-year-old son suddenly dies in some accident in Russia. He fell down a stairwell, horrible tragedy, and this devastates Colin as you can imagine. Then he falls for some get-rich-quick scam. Some guy in the Philippines cons him out of his life savings, about 350,000 pounds, or around 467,000 US dollars. So all that money he made from his wife's death, from the will and the life insurance, he loses it all, and he falls deep into debt. Womp womp. So now he's broke and one of his kids is dead and he doesn't know what to do. Like he's never felt this low in his life. And keep in mind, he's still a very religious guy. So he sees all this bad luck as some kind of sign that his God is punishing him. Punishing him for all the bad things he's done in his life, specifically punishing him for unaliving his wife and for unaliving Hazel's husband all those years ago. So he starts thinking that it'll help if he confesses. So he goes and he calls some of the elders of his church to gather at his house and he sits them down and he starts confessing. I guess he thinks this is going to completely absolve him of his crimes. Like the church is just going to be like, oh, it's fine that you committed murder. We're all good with that just as long as you tell the truth. No. I mean, they're church elders, but they're also, human beings like anyone else. You go around most people talking about how you committed murder over a decade ago. Most people are going to be like, I don't want to be involved in this conversation. Whatever you did, bro, just leave me out of it. Anyway, during this gathering, Colin confesses a lot of things to these church elders. He confesses to his new wife that he had multiple affairs during their marriage. He confesses that he has a major addiction to pornography. He confesses that he sometimes likes to SA his dental patients while they're passed out in his dental chair, sedated. Wow. And finally, he confesses to unaliving his wife and Hazel's husband over a decade and a half ago. Bro is self-snitching like crazy. And the church elders, they hear this and they're like, holy shit, prayers are not gonna fix this one. And they call the police. And so the police come over and Colin confesses and bam, they arrest him. And he ends up snitching on Hazel, so bam, they arrest her too. And she gets sentenced to 18 years in prison while Colin gets a total of 26 years in prison. And here's what he looks like in real life. So this guy is a mega church preacher, and he gets a little pervy, and now he's on the run from the FBI. Now the guy's name is Apollo. He's 24, he's from the Philippines, and he's a small-time preacher there. And one day he's preaching in a little chapel when suddenly angels appear to him, and they come and they tell him that he's actually the son of his God. So he starts telling everyone that he is the appointed son of God. Well, I'm sure this will end well for him. So anyway, because of this, he decides to start his own church. And a few years later, after the church is founded, this guy shows up, Rodrigo. And Rodrigo's running for mayor, and he comes to speak to the congregation at the church. And they welcome him, and soon enough, he and Apollo become good friends. And later, Rodrigo actually gets elected mayor, and he appoints Apollo to be his spiritual advisor. And so then more people find out about Apollo and his teachings, and his church starts to grow, and soon the donations start rolling in. Because, of course they do. But these donations aren't enough for Apollo. He wants more. So he gets the full-time working members of the church to go out at 6 a.m. every morning and solicit money from strangers for the church. The only catch is they can't come home until they reach their daily quota of money collected. So to avoid sleeping on the street, the members of the church start playing on people's sympathy. Like they pretend to be poor college students or they pretend to be disabled, but whatever, it works. And the church makes a ton of money. And so pretty quickly, Pastor Apollo becomes a very wealthy man. He's so wealthy, in fact, that he's able to start his own broadcasting network. And this helps spread his teachings beyond the Philippines. So now he's got followers around the world in many different countries, including the United States. And this is where Apollo really levels up. And with the help of his innermost circle, he traffics his most obedient followers into the US, where they start working and soliciting donations from people full-time. So he's making even more money. Oh, and I haven't even gotten to some of the crazy stuff this guy claims. Aside from saying he's the son of some god, he once claimed that he yelled at an earthquake and made it stop. Like there was an earthquake happening, and he's just like, ah! And it just stopped. And he also says that the public should thank him for stopping that earthquake. Thanks, Apollo. He also claims that he talks to his god directly, not metaphorically, but like conversations directly. He also says that he has visions of his god. He claims that he has been physically taken up into heaven on multiple occasions. I mean, this guy has said and done way too much for me to cover in one video. But anyway, and if that's not crazy enough, here's the part of the story where things start to get creepy. Among his church workers, the ones who are young, attractive women and who excel at getting donations, they get to move up and become what's called pastoral assistants. And of course, the prettiest and most obedient pastoral assistants, they get into Apollo's inner circle, and they become what are called spiritual wives. And spiritual wives, they get a special privilege. They get the privilege of smashing with Apollo. Yeah, they literally call it night duty. And these pastoral assistants and spiritual wives are anywhere between 25 years old all the way down to 12 years old. Well, at this point in the story, Apollo is old as shit. He's 74. And if any of these girls or young women protest their night duty, they're then threatened with eternal damnation. So basically, if they don't smash with him, they're verbally threatened, physically threatened, or he tells them they're going to hell. And to make it worse, these young women depend on the church for their basic needs. Like they live and work at the church. Their entire social life is there. So they're kind of trapped in this. So he's basically trafficking these girls. Like this is sex trafficking. And this nonsense goes on for years, not just in the Philippines, but in their US locations too. And at this point, Apollo is a powerful man. Like his following has grown to over 6 million members worldwide. He claims he has followers in all 200 countries. Plus, with all those donations, he's now wealthier than he's ever been. Dude now owns a private jet and a personal helicopter. He has a church compound that's so massive. It has an indoor arena that seats 75,000 people. To put that in perspective, that's literally the biggest indoor arena in the entire world. And this dude owns it. That's how rich he is. Okay, but then rumors of him essaying young women, they start to spread. And of course, his followers don't believe he's guilty of anything. They stand by him. And religious culty type leaders always have followers who do this, so this is not surprising. But his longtime friend, Mayor Rodrigo, he ends up running for president and he wins. And with the president of the Philippines on his side, every accusation against Apollo is basically buried. So Apollo seems untouchable by this point. He's been running this trafficking business for like 16 years, and it doesn't seem like there are ever going to be any consequences for it. Until, I guess at some point, some of his former church members in the US, they go and report him to the FBI. And the FBI starts looking into him, and this investigation makes the news, and Apollo hears about it, and he's like, oh shit. And he allegedly flees the US, and he goes all the way back to the Philippines to his church compound there. And there, he'll be protected by his longtime friend, President Rodrigo. But unfortunately, his friend Rodrigo finishes his term as president, leaves office, and now there's a new president. And new president is not Apollo's friend. So all the accusations against him in the Philippines are no longer buried. So then, back in the US, bam, the FBI arrests some of his innermost circle, and they're officially looking for Apollo too. And he's being accused of fraud, human trafficking, and sex trafficking, and now he's on the FBI's most wanted list. And so Apollo, he gets all mad, and he's frustrated that they're after him, and he starts lashing out publicly, saying it's a conspiracy. And this is happening during the COVID pandemic. So he gives a sermon telling the world that if we want the pandemic to stop, the FBI should stop investigating him.
I'm warning the whole world. Listen to the voice of the appointed son. You want this pandemic to stop. Stop prosecuting, maligning the appointed son.
But then, even more women in the Philippines come forward with accusations against him. And of course, Apollo denies everything, and he insists that the people accusing him are just evil, and he changes the homepage of his website to this: why are evil people after Pastor Apollo? I'm guessing they're after him because of all the sex trafficking, but that's just a guess. Anyway, eventually, the Filipino Senate issues a warrant for his arrest, and they raid some of his properties, but the dude is nowhere to be found. He's fled, and he's hiding out from the law. And there's like this whole manhunt looking for him, and there ends up being a huge standoff at one of his compounds between police and a bunch of his supporters, and his supporters still insist that he didn't do anything wrong, and I don't even have time to get into that part of the story. But 2 weeks later, Apollo finally gives up, and he turns himself in, and bam, they arrest him. Here's his mugshot. And as of right now, he hasn't actually been to trial yet, so we'll see how this plays out. And thank you to Leonardo.ai for sponsoring this video. If you want to make badass art for your videos like this, or like this, or like this, then sign up for Leonardo.ai, or follow the link pinned in the comments, assuming this platform allows me to pin comments. So this guy tries to get rich by scamming a popular game show, and he kind of succeeds. Now the guy's name is Michael, and he's an ice cream man, but Michael doesn't want to be an ice cream man. He wants to get rich quick. So he comes up with this wild plan to do just that. And he gets a bunch of TVs, and he stacks them all on top of each other, and he watches game shows constantly trying to find one that he could potentially win money from. And one day, he does find one. There's a new game show called Press Your Luck, and the contestants are winning pretty good money, and Michael looks at these mediocre people playing, and he thinks, hey, I could do that. So he gets a VCR, and he records a bunch of episodes of the show, and he starts watching the tapes over and over again and studying them. And after several months, he finally figures it out. In the game, you win money by spinning the board and having it stop on a cash prize or a vacation. And the board, it seems to light up in random places. But Michael's been watching these episodes and pausing and replaying the tapes looking for patterns. And after 6 months, he discovers that the board lights up in 5 distinct looping patterns. And Michael thinks if he can just memorize these patterns, he can get on the show and he can win a bunch of money. So Michael memorizes these patterns, and he practices the timing at home, pausing and playing his VCR until he's a master at this game. Then he scrapes together all the money he can, and he buys a bus ticket to Los Angeles, and he shows up to the casting office of Press Your Luck. And he auditions, and he meets with the producers, and sure enough, bam, they cast him. So fast forward to the day of the taping, and Michael is there on the show, and he's nervous, but he's ready to win this.
Let's meet our second player, Michael Larson. All right, Michael.
And so eventually, it's Michael's turn to play. And when he finally gets his first spin on the board, it doesn't go so well.
Come on, big bucks, big bucks. I'm going. You gotta win.
And by the time the first round ends, poor Michael, he's in last place. But it's not over yet. This is what he's been training for. He is determined to win this money. So when his turn comes up again, he is ready this time. He gets a spin on the board, and bam, he stops the light, and he wins a nice little cash prize and an extra spin. And so he goes again, and bam, he wins again. And he continues, and he spins again and again, and he wins more and more. And soon, his winnings are over $30,000. Now at this point, the producers of the show, they start to get suspicious that Michael might be doing something shady. But the woman in the tech booth, who's supposed to be watching to make sure people aren't cheating, she can't find anything wrong with how he's playing. It seems to be pure skill. So Michael just keeps going. And as his winnings grow to $60,000, the producers are like, yo, shut it down. He's winning too much. But they can't, because he's not technically cheating. And like even the host is freaking out, because not only is Michael winning, he's like breaking all kinds of records.
At 133 spins, 4,000. You're up to 83,000.
And eventually, Michael cracks $100,000, which was his goal the whole time. And ultimately, he wins the whole game, winning $110,000 and a trip to the Bahamas. Not bad. Which at the time, in 1984, he had won more money than anyone had in a single episode of any American game show ever. And the suits at CBS are not happy about this, because they still suspect he cheated. But they can't prove anything, so they write him a big fat check and they send him on his way. Which means his plan has officially succeeded. However, Michael isn't done. He's still determined to get rich. Like, he's made getting rich his whole personality. And one day, he's listening to the radio and he hears about this contest. And in this contest, they're reading out serial numbers on $1 bills. And if you have a dollar bill that matches the number they read, you win $30,000. So Michael goes to the bank and he withdraws $50,000 of his game show winnings in $1 bills. And then he and his wife, they sit at their house and they look through each $1 bill for any one that matches the winning serial number. And they do this for weeks. But unfortunately, no luck. So Michael takes half the money and he puts it back in the bank, and the other half he just hides in random places around his house. But then sometime later, one night someone breaks into his place and they steal all the dollar bills he had hidden around his house. And Michael, he gets mad and he straight up blames his own wife for being involved in the burglary. And then she gets mad at him, and then she takes her kids and she just straight up leaves him. And then later he gets a new girlfriend and they start some pyramid scheme together where they get people to invest in a fake lottery, and they end up scamming a bunch of people out of $3 million. So I guess he met his goal and he's finally rich now. But eventually the SEC, the FBI, and the IRS catch on to his scam and they go after him. But he goes on the run from the law and he stays on the run for a long time. In fact, they never catch him. And eventually he dies, and they only find him after he died. And he died from cancer, which is unrelated to any of this, but he technically got away. So shout out to Michael, I guess. So this guy, his name's Gary, and Gary just got away with murder. And I bet you're gonna be glad he did. So the story actually starts with Gary's son, this kid. His name's Jody. He's 10. And Jody's an active kid. He really likes sports, and one day he gets involved in karate. And he really likes karate, and he's actually pretty good at it. And he also really likes his karate instructor, this guy, Doucette. He's 24. Now Doucette is a friendly guy, but teaching karate is his only source of income. So he's kind of broke. In fact, he's so broke, he lives at the karate studio. Now, Gary feels bad for Doucette because he's such a nice guy and he seems to be good with the kids. So Gary decides to let Doucette eat dinner with the family sometimes. He lets him borrow their shower when he needs it. And so Doucette, who's over there all the time, he ends up becoming a family friend. So now he's always teaching Jody karate, he's driving him home from practice, he's taking him out to see movies, and they have a lot of fun together. And this relationship goes on for a while. But here's where the story gets dark. Turns out Doucette is low-key a creep. And once the family starts trusting him, he starts testing boundaries with Jody, touching him when they're alone, seeing how far he can get. And this is a common thing that P3DOs do. They'll often test boundaries little by little to see how far they can get, to see if anyone calls them out on it. And they'll test boundaries with the parents too. They'll take the kid out for a few hours to see how long it takes for the parents to get worried, stuff like that. And this is exactly what Doucette does. And after a few months of testing these boundaries with Jody and his parents, he straight up starts essaying Jody. And he's always hanging around the family, so he gets to do it frequently, nearly every day, anytime he can get Jody alone. And the whole time, Doucette is pretending to be Jody's friend. He's always taking Jody to the local movie theater and on trips to karate tournaments and stuff. And Jody, with his 10-year-old brain, he doesn't know what to make of all this. He doesn't like the touching stuff, he thinks it's weird. But he likes hanging out with Doucette because he's older than him, but he's not nearly as old as his parents. But he is still an older guy, so he's still got that like cool factor going on. So young Jody doesn't know any better, and he doesn't tell anyone about the essay or about any of the inappropriate stuff going on. And all this goes on for about a year. But then it really goes wrong. Because one morning, Doucette, he comes over to Jody's house, and Jody's mom is there. And we'll just call her Mom. And Doucette asks Mom if he can borrow their car because he needs to run an errand. And Mom's like, sure, Doucette, you can use the car. And then he asks if Jody can ride along with him. And Mom's like, sure, have fun. So they leave, and several hours pass. And Mom notices Doucette hasn't come back yet, and she starts panicking. Where the hell are they? Did something happen to them? And so she calls police. Meanwhile, Doucette has got Jody in the car, and they're driving west because Doucette is officially kidnapping him. And they make a few stops, but then they end up at Doucette's uncle's house where they ditch the car. And then he and Jody, they get on a bus and they go from Louisiana all the way to Los Angeles. Now, Jody's 11 at this point, so naturally he doesn't fully comprehend the gravity of everything that's going on. I mean, he still thinks Doucette is his cool older friend and that they're somehow out on some kind of adventure. And so while they're in Los Angeles, Doucette walks them around downtown and they see a TV show being filmed and he gets to see the Hollywood sign. And then that same day, they get on another bus and they travel from Los Angeles down over to Anaheim. And they stay in a motel. And then the next day, Doucette takes Jody to Disneyland. And he's 11, so I'm sure he has a good time. Now, at this point, Jody has been missing for 9 whole days. And Gary and Mom, they're back home and they are going insane. And there's a nationwide manhunt looking for these two, and the FBI is now involved, and no one really knows if they're ever going to see Jody again. Until Doucette makes a big mistake. Because that night at the motel, he decides to allow Jody to make a call back home to his mom. And so Jody calls his mom and they have a quick talk. But what Doucette doesn't know, and what Mom doesn't even know at this point, is that the FBI had tapped her phone. Because they were hoping that at some point Doucette would call. And they were right. So they trace the call, and pretty quickly, boom, police bust through the motel door, and bam, they arrest Doucette. Here's his mugshot. And Jody ultimately gets sent back home to Baton Rouge to be with his parents. But here's where the story gets really crazy. They put Doucette in jail, and 2 weeks later, they extradite him from California all the way back to Baton Rouge. That same day, Gary goes to a local restaurant to get lunch. And even though he just got his son back, he's still upset. I mean, police told him all the terrible things Doucette did to Jody. So Gary is just sickened by all this, and he can't get over it. It's eating him alive, which I assume would be normal for any parent. I mean, your son gets kidnapped and violated. I imagine you'd be losing your mind too. Think of all the crazy shit, wanting to punch holes in the wall. I mean, you'd be mad, I would. So anyway, Gary's at this restaurant, and a local news reporter recognizes him. And he's like, hey, Gary, do you know what time Doucette's extradition is? And of course, Gary doesn't know. I mean, police never told him. But then that reporter finds out the information, and for some reason, he goes back to Gary and tells him, hey, turns out they're gonna be bringing Doucette through Baton Rouge Airport around 9 o'clock tonight. And that moment is when Gary just snaps, and he decides he's gonna get revenge on Doucette. And he goes and he gets his pew-pew and he heads to the airport because he is not gonna let this slide. It's about to get real. And so he's there at the airport, and he's wearing a disguise, a baseball hat and sunglasses. And there are news camera crews and police all over the place, and everyone is there waiting for officers to arrive and perp walk Doucette through the area. And Gary, he gets on a payphone, and he's got his back to everyone so that no one will see him and recognize him. And that is when the police escort enters, and they're walking through with Doucette, and he's right here. And right as they walk past Gary, and Gary's here, he quickly grabs his pew-pew, and he points it at Doucette's head, and blam! Now, obviously, I can't show you the full video. It's way too gruesome, and I want my video removed. But the local news camera crews captured the whole thing. And so, bam, Gary is immediately arrested, and Doucette is rushed to the hospital, and there, he actually dies the next day. But here's the complicated part. Jody is actually mad at Gary over all this, because in his 11-year-old mind, he saw Doucette as his good friend. The guy who showed him around LA and took him to Disneyland. And from his perspective, his dad just suddenly unalived his good friend. And Jody stays mad at him for a long time. But eventually, they do mend their relationship, and they make up. But anyway, Gary ends up taking a plea deal where the charges against him are dropped down to manslaughter. So at the end of it all, he only gets community service and 5 years probation for unaliving this predator. And ultimately, he spends 0 time in prison for this. And here is what he looked like in real life. So this guy, he really wants to be a celebrity. He likes the idea of fame, and he just really wants to be around celebrities. Now, his name is Dr. Landy, and Dr. Landy is not a celebrity. He's a psychologist. And one day, he gets an idea for a crazy and controversial new type of therapy treatment. But we'll get to that. First, we gotta talk about the Beach Boys, the band who's touring the world and topping the charts. Specifically, we gotta talk about the lead singer, this guy, Brian. And Brian, he's kind of a musical genius, but unfortunately, he's got a lot of undiagnosed mental health issues. And at this time, he's touring around, he's soaking in the fame, and he's dealing with that rock and roll lifestyle. And it's a lot for the guy to handle. So he does what a lot of rock stars do. He starts using drugs heavily, and he gains a bunch of weight, and sometimes he has nervous breakdowns, and he's been hearing voices. And because of all this, he stops touring, and he stops recording with his band. Bro is just a mess. So one day, Brian's wife, who we'll just call wife, she gets worried about him, and she seeks out a psychologist to help. The psychologist ends up being Dr. Landy. And Dr. Landy, the guy who wants nothing more than to be around celebrities, he agrees to help. So he starts to work with Brian, and immediately he diagnoses him as a paranoid schizophrenic. And this diagnosis is important because it's the wrong diagnosis, but we'll get to that. Regardless, Landy starts helping Brian, and he puts him on this controversial new type of therapy treatment he came up with. It's an intensive 24-hour therapy program where he hires assistants to watch over Brian constantly, and he has him start a fitness routine, and he gets him to start eating better, and he gets him on medication. And for this experimental therapy program, he charges $10,000 monthly, which in today's dollars is about $58,000 a month. But after doing this treatment, Brian does slowly start to show signs of improvement. He gets more productive, his mood gets better, he starts socializing again. But then, after about a year in this program, Dr. Landy decides to raise his rates from $10,000 monthly to $20,000 monthly, which in today's dollars is nearly $110,000 a month for therapy. And so the Beach Boys manager, he sees this and he's like, oh, well, this is bullshit. And he fires Dr. Landy, like done. And everyone just moves on. A few years later, Brian, he isn't doing so well again. He's back to abusing drugs and alcohol. His weight gets up to over 300 pounds. His mental health just spirals out of control. And he and his wife, they end up getting divorced. And at one point, he attacks a therapist and he gets committed to a mental health facility for a few months. Like it's going really bad for him. And eventually, Brian overdoses. And his family and his management team, they don't know what to do. So they agree to do the only thing that kind of worked for him in the past. They allow him to see Dr. Landy again. So they hit up Landy and they ask him to help. And Landy agrees to take Brian as a patient again in his 24-hour treatment program. But this time, he wants 2 things. 1, he wants total control of Brian's affairs without interference from anyone. And 2, he wants to charge a new, even higher fee, $35,000 monthly, which in today's dollars is about $114,000 a month. Damn. So the family reluctantly agrees, and Landy takes over, and he controls everything in Brian's life. All decisions Brian makes have to go through him. He's his legal guardian now. And he puts Brian on a strict exercise plan. He throws cold water on Brian in the mornings to wake him up. He padlocks the fridge so Brian can't get into it unless he lets him. But most importantly, he controls who Brian interacts with. And he isn't allowed to contact his friends or his ex-wife or even his kids. And not only that, he keeps Brian pretty drugged up too on antipsychotic meds. So Brian's kind of a zombie at this point. And again, Dr. Landy has a team of assistants watching over him 24/7 to make sure he's complying with all these new rules. But to be kind of fair, the treatment does seem to be working, I guess. I mean, Brian is technically sober now, and he's losing weight, and he's way over-medicated, so I guess he's not hearing voices as much as he was before. But here's where things get really messed up. Dr. Landy now controls all aspects of Brian's life. So not only is he charging Brian $1 million a year in monthly fees, but he is able to anoint himself as Brian's creative and financial partner. And he's able to negotiate himself a quarter of Brian's publishing royalties on some of the Beach Boys songs. So songs that Brian writes on, Landy is now earning royalties off of them, and he's able to name himself co-writer on a bunch of the songs that Brian writes. I mean, at one point, Landy even says, and I quote, "I influence all of Brian's thinking. I'm practically a member of the band." And then, when Brian starts working on solo material, Landy names himself executive producer on the solo albums, and he gets himself credited as a co-songwriter on a bunch of the songs. This dude is shady as fuck. But around this time, Brian is at a car dealership buying a car one day, and he meets this woman, Melinda. And they hit it off, and they start dating, and Melinda really likes Brian. However, once she gets close to him, she starts to see this crazy control that Landy has over his entire life, and she doesn't like it. She thinks it's unethical, which it is. So she starts raising hell, bringing it to everyone's attention. She even reports Landy to the state attorney general. And of course, Landy doesn't like her back. I mean, he doesn't like anyone getting in between him and Brian. So eventually, after she and Brian had been dating for about 3 years, Landy gets so mad at her that he forbids Brian from seeing her. I guess he's just like, you're not allowed to see her anymore. And he's Brian's legal guardian, so Brian just stops seeing Melinda. And eventually, after all this hell has been raised, Brian's family gets involved in all this, and they don't like what's going on. And at some point, they get a hold of a copy of a will that Brian had allegedly made out. And in this will, he states that if he dies, he's gonna give Dr. Landy 70% of all his assets. 70%! And this is the last straw for everyone. They're not gonna let Brian give 70% of everything he's earned to his shady therapist. So the family ends up suing Dr. Landy, and they file a restraining order against him. And this story blows up, and Dr. Landy has to like go on TV and try and defend himself.
But Dr. Landy, there is a rule against that. It's against the code of your profession.
It's a rule that I can't explain it to you.
Now eventually, Brian's family wins, and the court bars Landy from ever contacting Brian again. Good. That same year, with Landy out of his life, Brian reconnects with Melinda, and they fall back in love, and they get married a few years after that. And eventually, she gets him reevaluated and gets his mental condition properly diagnosed. And doctors discover that he has not paranoid schizophrenia, but a schizoaffective disorder with a mild bipolar disorder, which is a different thing and is treated differently. And once they treat Brian properly and getting the right meds, he ends up doing a lot better. Good for him. And here's what he looks like now in real life. So this French guy, his name's Michel, and Michel has successfully broken out of prison 5 different times. Until, well, you'll see. So Michel's pretty good at busting himself out of prison. Like once he snuck out by hiding in a delivery truck, another time he scaled the wall with one of those ropes made of bed sheets. Bro is a pro at this. He's like the MacGyver of prison breaks. But then, one day, it all changes. Because while he's a fugitive on the run, he meets this woman, Nadine. And Nadine, she's a bit of a turd herself. She's got a criminal record too. And she thinks Michel is fine. And they hook up and they fall in love and they live a life where they have to move around the countryside a lot so that Michel doesn't get caught. But eventually, they run into a big problem. They're out of money. And Michel can't just go get a regular job. He's a fugitive on the run. So he's like, guess I'll just start robbing places. And so he starts robbing places and people, and soon enough, police catch up to him and they bust him. So he goes to prison for like the 4th time in his life. And he and Nadine actually get married while he's in prison. And I'm sure it was a beautiful ceremony. But he's not there long before he gets a crazy idea to bust himself out again. And one day he gets a bar of soap and he carves it to look like a pew-pew. And he paints it black with shoe polish. Which I gotta say, carving a believable firearm out of soap, that's actually pretty impressive. But anyway, then he has to go to court for a hearing. And while he's there, he pulls out his fake soap pew-pew and he threatens to shoot everyone in the room. And by doing this, he's able to escape prison yet again. And honestly, at this point, I'm like kind of cheering for him. Oh, but it's not over. Because then Michel and Nadine, they run off and they hide out in the countryside for about 2 years. And unfortunately, that's when they run into another big problem. Nadine is pregnant. And if you know anything about babies, babies aren't cheap. So again, they need money to live and to raise this kid. And Michel is like, well, guess I gotta go rob some more places. Because as clever of a guy as he is, I guess he just doesn't know how to do anything else. So he's gotta steal shit. And of all the places he could rob, he chooses a bank. A heavily guarded bank. So he goes to rob this bank. And during this robbery, it's all chaos. And it all goes wrong. And police show up and he ends up shooting a police officer. And so he gets caught and he's sent back to prison again, this time with an even longer sentence. Oh, but you know Michel. He's not gonna stay in prison for long before he tries to escape again. And it takes a few years, but eventually he and Nadine, they come up with a plan to bust him out. And this plan is wild. In fact, it's probably the craziest prison break story I've ever heard. So first, Nadine goes and she gets helicopter flying lessons from an instructor. And she takes these lessons and after a few months of dedication, she passes the exam and she legitimately gets her helicopter pilot's license. And this is an actual photo of her sitting in a helicopter during a lesson. And apparently she's a decent student. She actually ends up being pretty good at flying. So then one day she goes to visit Michel in prison and she low-key slips him a note. This note tells him to meet her on the roof of the prison on the morning of May 26, 10 a.m. And Michel's like, all right. Now, to get on the roof of the prison, Michel is gonna need to create a distraction. So he and his prison buddy, this guy, Pierre, they steal a bunch of nectarines from the prison cafeteria and they paint them to look like grenades. Like I said, bro is the MacGyver of prison breaks. But anyway, then the big day finally comes, May 26th, 10 a.m. And just before this, Nadine, with her new pilot's license, she goes and she rents a helicopter. And she and an accomplice fly about 19 miles to Paris proper, and they hover the helicopter over the prison. Meanwhile, inside, Michel, he hears the approaching helicopter outside. So he and Pierre, they pull out their fake nectarine hand grenades, and they're like, we're gonna blow this whole place up if you guards don't back off. And to the guards, these look like real grenades. So they listen, and they back away. And Michel and Pierre, they make their way up to the roof. And then they bust out, and they see Nadine's helicopter is hovering there above them, and she throws a rope down. And Michel, he starts to climb up it. And Nadine's accomplice, he pulls out a pew-pew to cover Michel while he climbs up. And believe it or not, there are actual photos of all of this going down. And like you can see Michel there hanging from the helicopter, and all the prisoners down below are cheering him on like, yay, go Michel. I mean, this is all just entertainment to them. Like one of their fellow inmates is busting out. How could they not cheer them on? Anyway, so Michel gets into the helicopter, and the guards are closing in. And Nadine, she panics, and she pulls away, and she flees. And poor Pierre is still standing there. And he's like, oh, sacre bleu, as the guards tackle him. They left Pierre behind so that they could get away. Imagine being Pierre and doing all that work to orchestrate a prison break, and then that prison break is successful, but your partners in crime panic, and they accidentally leave you behind. That poor guy. So anyway, further away, Nadine lands the helicopter in a soccer field nearby, and the 3 fugitives, they abandon it, and they flee. And so they're out now, which means that once again, Michel has successfully escaped from lockup. But then, about 4 months go by, and French police, they're able to track Nadine down, and bam, they arrest her. And she gets 10 months in prison, which to me, 10 months seems a little light for the crazy stunt they just pulled, but whatever, they caught her. Meanwhile, Michel doesn't get caught. He's still hidden, and he goes and he tries to rob yet another bank, and during the robbery, police show up, and there's this whole big shootout, and then kaboom! An officer shoots Michel right in the head. Now, lucky for him, he actually survives, and he's in a coma for a while, and he's paralyzed on one side of his body, but eventually he recovers. And that's when they send him to a maximum security prison, which is probably where they should have sent him 4 prison breaks ago. But regardless, over time, he and Nadine end up getting a divorce. And while he's in this prison, this woman on the outside, her name's Jamila, she starts writing him, and they become pen pals, and eventually they fall in love. Now, the crazy thing is, she also ends up trying to break him out. And not only does she try to break him out, but she tries to break him out roughly the same way that Nadine did all those years before, with a helicopter. So Jamila hijacks a helicopter by sticking up the pilot, and she has him fly them to Michel's new prison. But they don't even get close to the prison. The plan fails, and Jamila's arrested, and she gets 7 years. Meanwhile, Michel, he serves his sentence. He spends 17 years locked up. He never successfully escapes from prison again, and he actually got out legally in 2003. So he's out now, and here's what he looked like in real life. So this 19-year-old girl, she ends up robbing a bunch of celebrities. Now the girl, her name's Rachel, and Rachel lives a nice, comfortable, upper-middle-class life. But for some reason, this life is not enough for her. She wants more. And so one day, Rachel and her best friend, this guy, Nick's 18, Rachel and Nick, they decide, hey, let's cruise through some rich neighborhoods and break into some cars. So they do this, and they get some decent stuff from it. But that's still not enough for Rachel. She still wants more. Now, they live in the Los Angeles area, in Calabasas. So they get this idea. They're like, hey, celebrities live around here. Why don't we rob some of their houses? They probably got some good stuff, and we can look up where they live online. This is their plan. And so they go and they choose their first victim, Paris Hilton. And one night, Rachel and Nick, they make their way over to Paris Hilton's house. And they're kind of nervous because they have no idea what they're actually doing. And luckily, Paris isn't home. And when Rachel and Nick get to the door, they discover that breaking in is going to be really easy because Paris actually left a key underneath the doormat. But even so, they don't even really need that key because Paris also left the door unlocked. Anyway, so they enter into the house and they walk around and they go into her bedrooms and they go through all her things and they steal some designer bras and some bottles of Grey Goose and some cash from her safe, which Paris also left unlocked. And after that, they just leave and they get away. And the best part for Rachel and Nick is they don't get caught because either Paris didn't report that she was robbed or she just didn't notice. Either way, Rachel and Nick are like, hey, that was dope. We just got away with robbery. And Rachel even puts like Paris's spare key that they found on her own key ring. And later they actually used this key to rob Paris's house 4 more times over the next few months. Now, of course, because Rachel and Nick are 18 and 19 years old, they can't keep this a secret from their friends. They gotta flex. So they go around and they start yapping to some of their homies, and now some of them want in on this action. And so some of their friends start joining in here and there. And by now, Rachel and Nick, they're doing these robberies as often as they can. Apparently stealing lots of like luxury items and designer clothes that they wear when they're like out with their friends. But here's the thing. These guys aren't career cat burglars. So it doesn't take long before they start to get sloppy. And one night, they rob Paris Hilton's house again for the 4th time. And one of the friends in Rachel's group, he steals almost $2 million worth of jewelry from her. And of course, this time Paris eventually notices and she reports it to the police. And on another night, the group, they actually break into this reality TV star's place, Audrina Partridge, and they take $43,000 worth of stuff, a laptop and some jewelry and stuff like that. But Audrina Partridge catches them on security camera, and she posts that footage on her website. So the people will see the burglars and hopefully be able to identify them and turn them in. Once she posts this footage to her website, TMZ and the local news stations, they pick up this story. And they run the video for everyone to see. But lucky for Rachel, no one recognizes them and no one comes forward to turn her in, so the crew keeps going. And they rob Rachel Bilson's house like 6 different times over 2 months, and they take over $130,000 in things. They rob Orlando Bloom's house, and they end up taking $500,000 worth of art and Rolexes. So these guys are going strong, and it seems like they might never get caught. Until the gang decides they're gonna hit Lindsay Lohan's house. And this is where they screw up. Because while they're there at Lindsay Lohan's house, stealing a ton of whatever Lindsay Lohan has in her house, security cameras catch them again. And I guess later, Lindsay Lohan notices all her shit is missing, and she takes the security footage and she gives it to police. And police, they release that footage to the public. So now there are 2 videos of Rachel and her friends circulating around for everyone to see. And of course, this story makes the news again, and at some point, the media starts referring to Rachel, Nick, and her friends as the Bling Ring, which is kind of a cool name. But once this second security video goes public, that's when people start recognizing them. And Rachel and Nick, they've bragged about these robberies at parties and in social settings so much that people start putting 2 and 2 together, and the police, they start getting tons of tips from people. And police already had suspicions about Rachel and Nick just because of all the rumors that had been flying around, because they just couldn't keep their mouth shut about it. So anyway, bam, police go and they arrest Nick. Here's his mugshot. And he denies everything, but eventually he gives in and he snitches on everyone else in their crew. And bam, one by one, they all get arrested. Here's Rachel's mugshot, and here are other mugshots from other members of the Bling Ring. And poor Rachel, she's sentenced to 4 years in prison, and Nick is sentenced to 2 years in prison, and another guy gets 3 years, and another woman gets 180 days in jail, and 3 others get sentenced to probation. So shout out to keeping your door locked, I guess. So one day, this 55-year-old man is in a grocery store parking lot when suddenly, bang, he gets shot. He's unalived. The next day, bang, a guy is shot while he's mowing the lawn. Then, bang, a cab driver is shot while pumping gas. Then, bang, a woman at a post office is shot. Then, bang, another woman at a gas station. And then later that night, bang, an older man who's just walking along on the sidewalk. Now, after all these random shootings, the police chief of Montgomery County, Maryland, this guy, Moose is like, well, these shootings, they gotta be connected. But unfortunately, police, they have no real leads. And then the next day, bang, another woman is shot while she's loading bags into her car. Luckily, this woman survives. And Moose and the rest of the police are like, what the fuck? Because none of the victims fit the same profile. It's like none of the victims are connected. Then, a few days later, a 13-year-old kid is getting out of his aunt's car to go to school, and bang, he gets shot. And when police investigate the scene where the kid got shot, they find a tarot card with a message written on it. Call me God. And while police are investigating that, bang, another person gets unalived while they're pumping gas. And at this point, Moose, he's stressed out over this. It seems like no one in the area is safe, and police are doing everything they can. They're working with the FBI, they've set up a tip line to see if anyone has any information, but nothing seems to help. And by this point, the word of these shootings has hit national news, and the information has spread, and the people in the DC area are all freaked out, and people are staying indoors, and the schools in the area are on lockdown. Like, they won't even let kids go out for recess. And over the next few days, 3 more people are shot. Bang, 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 and only one of them survives. However, this time, police are able to recover the bullet from inside that survivor's chest, which confirms all the shootings are connected to the same firearm, meaning they were done by the same person. They also find a ransom note in the woods near one of the shootings, and in this note, this mysterious shooter is referring to himself as some kind of god once again, and he's now demanding $10 million, or he'll keep unaliving people. Then, a few days later, bang, the shooter unalives a bus driver about to start his shift. So the shootings haven't stopped, and it doesn't look like this guy is ever gonna get caught. Until Moose, he's still working hard on this case. And in that ransom note they found, the killer mentions that he had once tried to contact police via the tip line they set up. And Moose is like, wait, he called the tip line? So police look into this, and yeah, it's true. Someone did call the tip line. But this caller claimed to be involved with an earlier liquor store robbery and shooting all the way over in Alabama. I guess police had assumed it was an unrelated crime because Alabama is so many states away from where they are in the DC area. So they look into this robbery that happened in Alabama. And it turns out the robber had accidentally left a fingerprint at the scene. So then who is this mysterious shooter? Well, it all starts with this guy, John Mohammed. And one day, John Mohammed is traveling and he's in Antigua and he meets this kid, Malvo. Malvo's 14. And John Mohammed becomes like a father to Malvo, and they continue this relationship for years. So 3 years later, they end up in the US, in Washington State. And John Mohammed is 41 now, and Malvo is 17. And John Mohammed, he's kind of an angry dude. Like, he's just mad about a lot of shit. Particularly, he's mad about his ex-wife. And he also knows how to use a pew-pew. So he starts telling Malvo about this secret mission he wants him to be a part of, and he starts training him, and like teaching him how to use weapons and how to withstand an interrogation if he ever gets caught, and stuff like that. And eventually, John Mohammed gives Malvo his first task. He's like, first, you need to unalive my ex-wife's friend's niece. So then, Malvo Malvo goes and he knocks on the niece's door, and when she answers, bang, he shoots her right in the face. Then a few weeks later, John Muhammad and Malvo, they take off on a road trip across the US. And they make their way south and then east, and John Muhammad keeps giving Malvo new targets as they zigzag across state lines. And these targets are just random people, and Malvo shoots them all. Then they eventually end up in the DC, Maryland area. And while they're there, they buy a car, a blue Chevy Caprice. And this Caprice has a hole cut in it just above the trunk, like this right here. Now this hole allows them to hide in the trunk and shoot people through that hole without anyone seeing them. So then in this DC, Maryland area, they go on this shooting spree. And they unalive a bunch of people, and no one knows who they are until the FBI gets a hold of that one fingerprint from the liquor store robbery in Alabama. And then they run that print through their system, and boom, there's a match. That fingerprint is Malvo's, who they pretty quickly link to John Muhammad. So finally, they know who they're looking for. Not a lone shooter, but a duo of shooters. So then they link John Muhammad to his car, the blue Chevy Caprice, and they put out this info all over the media that they're looking for this particular car. Then a few days later, in the late hours of the AM, they get a tip about the car, and they find the Caprice parked at a rest stop with John Muhammad and Malvo asleep inside. So after almost a month of terror, bam, police arrest John Muhammad. Here's his mugshot. And then bam, they arrest Malvo. Here's his mugshot. And Malvo gets life in prison, and John Muhammad gets the death penalty, and eventually he's executed. And a big shout out to Leonardo.ai for sponsoring this video. If you want to make really cool art for your videos like this, or like this, or like this, sign up for Leonardo.ai or follow the link pinned at the top of the comments, assuming this platform allows me to pin comments. So this guy, let's call him G.I. Joe, because that's what people call him. And G.I. Joe is a police officer. And one day, he's patrolling around this abandoned factory when he spots 3 suspicious-looking people, 2 white guys and a black guy. And he goes to check them out, and he starts following them, and suddenly, bang, he gets shot in the chest. He's unalived. So then a huge manhunt begins. Dogs and helicopters and the FBI and the U.S. Marshal Service, over 400 law enforcement are all looking for these 3 mysterious guys who shot G.I. Joe. And this small town is devastated. I mean, G.I. Joe was really well-loved. He had a good reputation in the community. But most importantly, he was the leader of this youth program, a program that encourages young adults to eventually go into law enforcement, the Explorer Post program. And he loved this program. I mean, it was everything to him. And the youth, they all loved him too.
Truly did care about his community. He was always involved with community events, village events, etc.
So if the community loved him so much, who were these 3 random guys who suddenly decided to unalive G.I. Joe? All right, before we answer that, let's talk about Joe for a minute, because he's an interesting guy. Now, after he dies, they release his personal records. And let's just say there's a whole other side of him that the community didn't know about. For example, he's kind of a drunk. Like one day, he gets so drunk that he passes out in his truck on the shoulder of the highway. And another officer finds him, and G.I. Joe is so drunk that the officer can't even wake him up. So then a detective from his town has to take him home, and they have to have his truck towed. And the next morning, G.I. Joe, he can't remember any of this. So he calls and reports his truck as stolen. And the detective who dropped him off at home has to be like, yo, you were drunk, bro, so we had to tow your truck. So anyway, G.I. Joe is that kind of guy. And as the years go by, G.I. Joe's behavior, it only gets crazier. Like he's showing up to work late, or he just doesn't even show up at all. He gets suspended a number of times, and like eventually his boss has to demote him from commander down to sergeant because I guess he got mad one day and threatened to shoot a dispatcher. Also, a woman who works under his command in the police department, she files a lawsuit against him for sexual misconduct. Then, a few years after that, someone submits an anonymous letter to the mayor of the town on behalf of some of the members of the police department. Basically, these unnamed police department employees, they all accuse G.I. Joe of all kinds of stuff. Sexual harassment, being constantly thrown out of places for being too drunk, taking his family on vacation in the police squad car, pressuring his subordinates to hook up with him, groping women's boobs at the company Christmas party. This dude is a menace. But despite all that, G.I. Joe still doesn't get fired, and he continues his life still working as a police officer, still working as the head of the Explorer Post program. Now, he's been an officer for several decades now, but then, at some point, G.I. Joe, he's put in all these years of work into the force, and he's put in all these years of hard work for the youths, and I guess he starts feeling entitled, and he feels he isn't getting a fair return. And to be honest, I don't really know what motivates him to do this next thing he's about to do, but one day, he starts stealing money from the Explorer Post program. I guess there's like a bank account for the program, and he treats that bank account like it's his own personal bank account, and he just like spends money from it on random shit, like he'll buy himself like Starbucks, which is not that big of a deal, but he also pays for his gym membership, his travel expenses, his mortgage, his kids' college. He even pays for adult websites with this money. What the hell kind of person uses funds from the youth program to subscribe to porn sites? Come on, G.I. Joe. But anyway, he embezzles all this money from the youth program for almost 7 years. And like his wife and his adult son are apparently all involved in this scam too, because they're getting some of the money. But no one outside this seems to notice that this crime is even going on. Until one day, this new administrator starts working for the town. Her name's Anne. And Anne, she's overseeing the budgets and the funds. And unlike G.I. Joe, she's really good at her job and not corrupt. And she starts doing an audit of the Explorer program. And eventually, Anne starts asking G.I. Joe to provide accounting and inventory for this program. I mean, she wants to see where all that money is going. And of course, G.I. Joe panics. I mean, he doesn't know what to do. I mean, if she finds out he's been stealing from the youth program, his life, his reputation, and his career, they're all ruined. So he starts kicking around all kinds of ideas about how to fix this. I mean, he considers setting Anne up and arresting her for a DUI. He considers planting drugs on her, like maybe that will get her fired. He even contacts a member of a local motorcycle gang, and he tries to get him to unalive her, but I guess that idea falls through. And then, finally, G.I. Joe comes up with what he feels is a solid plan. A plan to make sure all this goes away and that his reputation stays intact. A plan to make sure no one will find out about his embezzlement or any other crimes, and most importantly, a plan that will make sure that his family won't be accused of being involved in any of the crimes he's done. And then, one morning, he puts this plan into motion. He wakes up and he heads out toward the Explorer Post, where he's supposed to be finishing an equipment inventory for Anne. But instead of stopping there, he just keeps driving, and he drives all the way to this abandoned cement factory. Once he's there, he radios to dispatch, and he tells them he sees 3 suspicious men there, 2 white guys and a black guy, and that they're looking pretty shady. Here's the thing though, G.I. Joe doesn't see anyone there. He's making it all up. And then he tells the dispatch that the suspects have run away toward the swamp, and that he's gonna follow them, and that they need to send backup. And so dispatch listens, and they send some officers out his way. Then G.I. Joe, he takes his pew-pew, and he points it at his chest, and he fires. Bam! But the bullet is stopped by his bulletproof vest. Then he tries again. This time he makes sure to move his bulletproof vest out of the way. And bam, he succeeds. He unalives himself. And other officers have arrived on the scene and they investigate. And of course, they think these three mysterious men, two white guys and a black guy, that they unalived him and got away. Because that's what G.I. Joe wanted them to think. He staged the area to make it look like there was a struggle and everything. But after a thorough 2-month investigation, police finally figure out that there were no mysterious men. G.I. Joe made it all up.
This extensive investigation has concluded with an overwhelming amount of evidence that Glinowitz's death was a carefully staged suicide.
So I guess his plan didn't work, and now everyone knows that maybe he wasn't as good of a guy as everyone in the community once thought. And here's what he looked like in real life. So this guy is about to cheat at a game show, and it's gonna make him rich. Now his name is Charles, and Charles is a major in the British Army, and he's also broke as f***. And one day, he's with his wife, this woman, Diana, and he and Diana are looking at their finances, and they're like, oh bugger, how are we going to pay all this debt? Here's the thing though, not too long before this, Diana and her brother had both competed on a game show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? And by doing that, they won a little bit of money. So Diana and Charles think, what if Charles goes on the show? Maybe he could win a bunch of money, and that would more than get them out of debt. And that's a great plan. But there's a problem. Charles is kind of a dumbass. I mean, he's not dumb, he's just not the kind of person who knows the answers to a bunch of random trivia questions. And Who Wants to Be a Millionaire is not something he would naturally be good at. So he and Diana come up with a plan to cheat. And we'll get to that plan. But anyway, they sign Charles up to compete on the show, and they wait, and finally, the big moment comes. Game day. And they go to the studio, and he starts the first round of the show called Fastest Finger First.
Who's fastest? Charles Ingram! In 3.
He makes it through that round, and now he's on to the quiz part. Now, in the quiz part, he kind of struggles with the first few questions. And by the time he gets to the 4,000-pound question, he's already used 2 of his lifelines. So he's not doing very well at this game.
I think I'll phone a friend.
Okay. But then, the first day of filming ends there. And obviously, producers are like, well, Charles, he doesn't stand a chance. I mean, he's a dumbass. He's struggling on easy questions. But anyway, Charles and Diana, they go home, and this is where they enact their plan to cheat. The plan is, Diana wants to feed Charles answers while she's sitting in the audience. And they know they can't use like an earpiece to communicate or anything like that, because the show would check for that, and they'd get caught. So instead, they decide to go even simpler. All the show questions are multiple choice. So they're just gonna have Diana sit in the audience, and when Charles is about to answer a question, when he says the correct answer out loud, she'll cough. And in order to make the plan foolproof, they call this guy Wittick. And Wittick, he's a smart enough guy, he's a college lecturer, and he's also been a contestant on the show like 3 times before. And he's scheduled to be trying out for the show the next day. So they ask Wittick if he can help them out with their scam. And Wittick's like, right, jolly good show, or whatever. And so he'll be on the sidelines coughing too. Then the next night, they all go back to the studio to resume filming. And Charles is in the hot seat, and Diana's sitting in the audience, and Wittick is sitting on the sidelines. And Charles, he gets asked who is the second husband of Jackie Kennedy. And when he's reading out an answer, and whenever he reads out the right one, either Diana or Wittick or someone coughs. And you can hear the cough when you watch the footage.
Pretty confident it's Aristotle and Assus.
But whatever, he gets the question right, and his winnings are now up to 8,000 pounds. Then they move on to the next question, and the next. And at some point, the camera is on Diana in the audience, and you can see her coughing to signal him. Now at this point in the show, producers are starting to get a little suspicious. Like something weird is going on here, because Charles is so unsure about all the answers he's giving, yet all the answers he's giving are turning out to be correct. But they don't have any real evidence that he's doing anything wrong, so they let the show continue. Regardless, his plan is working, and Charles gets question after question right, with Diana coughing or Wittick coughing. And his winnings keep climbing up. 32,000 pounds, 64,000 pounds, 125,000 pounds, 250,000 pounds, $500,000. And soon enough, Charles is on the final question of the show, worth 1 million pounds, or about 1.3 million US dollars. And the producers of the show, they're like scrambling, because they know he's somehow cheating. So anyway, then the host reads the final 1 million pound question, and it's actually a fairly easy question.
The number 1, followed by 100 zeros, is known by what name? Google, Megatron, Gigabit, Nanomole.
And of course, Charles doesn't know the answer. Like I said, he's not good at this. And that's why he's cheating. But lucky for him, his cough squad is there to save him.
I don't think I've heard of a Google.
So Charles gives the answer, a Google. And of course,
You just won 1 million! You are the most amazing contestant we have ever had!
So Charles and Diana have officially won. Their plan worked, and they are now rich. Until. So Charles and Diana go back to their dressing room, but instead of celebrating, they start yelling at each other. They're in a fight for some reason, and security guards can hear them, and producers can also hear them. Now, allegedly, Charles wasn't supposed to go all the way to 1 million pounds. He was supposed to stop before that, because if he had only won like 100,000 pounds and stopped, no one would have suspected that he was cheating. But I guess at the last minute, he got greedy and he decided to go all the way to 1 million. And now Diana is mad at him because she thinks his greed is going to get them caught. Now, this fight that producers hear, it makes them even more suspicious. And once Charles and Diana leave, the producers, they immediately start combing through the footage of the episode looking for any evidence of them cheating. And of course, they notice the coughing. And they're like, I knew it! This motherfucker's cheating! So a producer literally has to call Charles and tell him that they won't be authorizing the $1 million check.
I have to tell you that we have suspicion from viewing the recording of last Monday's program that there were irregularities during the editing of the show. Oh, good Lord, no. Because of that, I have to tell you that these suspicions have been referred to the police.
So then producers get police involved, and bam, they arrest Charles and Diana and Wittick. And they all go to trial, and they're all found guilty, and Charles and Diana get sentenced to 18 months, and Wittick gets sentenced to 12 months. But their sentences are suspended, so none of them actually see any prison time. Anyway, here's how Charles and Diana look in real life. And thank you to Leonardo.ai for sponsoring this video. If you want to make badass art for your videos like this, or like this, or like this, then sign up for Leonardo.ai, or follow the link pinned in